When we delve into the historical interactions between Native American nations and the encroaching European colonial powers, particularly concerning the 17th century treatment of foreign captives during the tumultuous periods of resistance and warfare, a pervasive and often simplistic narrative tends to dominate popular perception. This narrative frequently conjures up images rooted in sensationalized accounts and biased historical records, often portraying indigenous peoples as indiscriminately savage or inherently cruel, especially in their handling of those they captured in battle. However, such a one-dimensional view fundamentally misrepresents the intricate, diverse, and deeply culturally embedded practices that characterize Native American societies. It's imperative to move beyond these reductive stereotypes to uncover the multifaceted realities of captive treatment, recognizing that there was no singular, monolithic approach adopted by all of the hundreds of distinct tribes across the vast North American continent. Instead, methods varied profoundly, not only from one nation to another, be it the Iroquois, the Lakota, the Cherokee, or the Pueblo, but also evolved significantly over time, adapting to shifting circumstances, the specific nature of conflicts, the intensity of colonial pressure, and even the individual discretion of tribal leaders or war parties. Therefore, rather than a blanket assertion of universal brutality, a more nuanced examination reveals a complex tapestry of responses that included, but were certainly not limited to, harsh, retributive actions. This rich historical tapestry demands a more critical and empathetic lens, one that acknowledges the profound clash of distinct cultural norms regarding warfare, honor, kinship, and the very concept of enemy combatants. The prevailing European military codes, which gradually developed conventions around prisoner of war status, stood in stark contrast to indigenous protocols, which were often deeply intertwined with spiritual beliefs, ceremonial practices, and community resilience. Understanding this fundamental divergence is the first crucial step in dismantling long-held misconceptions and appreciating the intricate humanity, resilience, and strategic thinking that underpinned Native American responses to the existential threat of colonization. Our exploration will challenge these facile assumptions, aiming to present a more accurate and comprehensive picture of a period that shaped the destiny of an entire continent, prompting us to question the very sources and biases that have traditionally informed our understanding of this critical chapter in history. This journey requires us to look beyond the surface-level accounts and delve into the deeper cultural rationales that guided decisions, offering a more balanced perspective on a topic too often distorted by prejudice and incomplete information. It is about understanding the why behind actions rather than just the what, ensuring a narrative that respects the complexity of indigenous histories and experiences. Following the initial engagement of capture, one of the most remarkable and often overlooked aspects of Native American society's interaction with foreign captives was the nuanced practice of adoption and integration, a custom that stands in stark contrast to the dominant European models of warfare and conquest. Far from a uniform policy of extermination or permanent incarceration, many indigenous communities possessed deeply ingrained traditions that allowed for the absorption of outsiders, including those taken during armed conflict. This practice was not merely an act of mercy, but served vital societal functions, particularly in response to the devastating losses incurred during periods of intertribal warfare or, later, due to the introduction of European diseases and the relentless pressure of colonial expansion. When a tribe suffered significant casualties, especially among women and children, integrating captives could be a strategic method for demographic replenishment, ensuring the continuity and strength of the community. These adopted individuals were not simply prisoners in a perpetual state of subjugation. Rather, they were often expected and sometimes encouraged to embrace the customs, language, and spiritual beliefs of their new families and tribe. Over time, many would undergo a profound transformation, shedding their former identities and becoming full, respected members of the adopting community. This process involved a genuine commitment from both the individual and the tribe. The captive had to demonstrate loyalty and a willingness to assimilate, while the tribe had to provide the support and acceptance necessary for true integration. Stories abound in historical records and oral traditions of European captives, both men and women, who after years of living among Native American nations chose to remain with their adoptive families even when presented with opportunities for repatriation to colonial society. Such choices highlight the depth of the bonds forged and the genuine sense of belonging that could be cultivated within these indigenous social structures. This practice underscores a fundamental difference in worldview. While European powers often sought to dominate and exploit conquered peoples, many Native American societies prioritized the strengthening of their own communal fabric, even if it meant incorporating former adversaries. The success of such adoption speaks volumes about the adaptable and resilient nature of indigenous social systems, offering a stark counterpoint to the simplistic narratives of unmitigated hostility that have long overshadowed the complexities of their interactions with colonial forces. It challenges us to reconsider what victory and defeat truly meant in these contexts, revealing a sophisticated approach to human resources and community survival that extended far beyond mere conquest. Beyond the remarkable instances of full adoption and cultural integration, another distinct dimension of Native American interaction with foreign captives involved various forms of servitude and labour, a practice that, while existing, diverged significantly in nature and purpose from the chattel slavery systems introduced and perpetuated by European colonizers. Unlike the brutal, lifelong and hereditary bondage that defined the transatlantic slave trade, where individuals were treated as property and deprived of all rights, indigenous forms of captivity for labour were often far more fluid and contextual. In many Native American societies, captured individuals might be assigned tasks ranging from domestic chores and agricultural work to assisting in hunting or even acting as guides or interpreters. This was often a pragmatic response to immediate needs within the community, such as a temporary shortage of labour due to warfare casualties, illness, or specific seasonal demands. The status of such captives was rarely fixed or permanent. Instead, it could be a transitional phase, potentially leading to eventual adoption, exchange, or even a degree of earned freedom. The social dynamics were fundamentally different. Captives were generally not considered property in the same dehumanizing sense, nor were they subject to the same systemic violence, breeding programs, or legal disenfranchisement that characterized European-style slavery. While their lives were certainly difficult and lacked the freedoms of tribal members, there was often an implicit understanding, or at least a possibility, that their situation could change. Escape, while risky, was also a more tangible prospect than for those caught in the rigid, commercially driven European slave systems. Furthermore, the motivation behind such servitude was rarely economic exploitation for profit accumulation on a grand scale, as was the case with colonial plantations. Instead, it was typically driven by the needs of the community itself, whether for practical assistance, population management, or as a form of reparations for harm inflicted during conflict. This distinction is crucial for a nuanced understanding, preventing the conflation of diverse indigenous practices with the singular, horrific institution of chattel slavery. The very concept of ownership of a human being was often alien or approached with vastly different cultural understandings than those brought by European settlers, whose economic systems were built upon the commodification of human life. Thus, while aspects of labour-based captivity existed, they must be situated within their specific cultural contexts, acknowledging their often temporary nature, their distinct social implications, and their fundamental divergence from the oppressive and deeply racialized structures of European colonial slavery, which irrevocably reshaped the social and economic landscapes of the Americas. This phase in a captive's life, while challenging, frequently held the potential for a different future, a possibility rarely afforded to those caught in the unforgiving machinery of colonial bondage. However, it would be an incomplete and indeed inaccurate portrayal to suggest that all interactions with foreign captives were characterized by adoption or temporary servitude. A darker, more brutal reality of retribution and ritual also existed, challenging simplistic notions of indigenous peace or universal benevolence. In specific contexts, and particularly in the throes of intense warfare and deeply entrenched rivalries, Native American nations did engage in practices that involved the torture and execution of captured enemies, including European settlers and soldiers. These acts, while horrifying to modern sensibilities and often seized upon by colonial narratives to demonize indigenous peoples, were rarely random or purely sadistic. Instead, they were frequently embedded within complex cultural frameworks, serving a variety of purposes that range from ceremonial revenge to demonstrations of power, and even as a means of absorbing the spiritual essence or courage of a fallen foe. For tribes like the Iroquois, in certain periods of their history, the treatment of captives could indeed be incredibly harsh, reflecting the ferocity of their long-standing conflicts with both other indigenous nations and the encroaching European powers. The intention might be to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies, to avenge past wrongs and losses suffered, or to fulfill specific ritualistic requirements tied to warfare and the spiritual balance of the community. It's crucial to understand that such practices were not typically an expression of a universally applied policy, but rather a response to the specific circumstances of conflict, the perceived actions of the enemy, or the particular traditions of a given war party or clan. When an enemy was seen as having committed particularly egregious acts, or when a tribe had suffered deeply, the desire for retribution could manifest in extreme forms. Furthermore, the very concept of warfare and the rules of engagement differed profoundly from European military codes. What one culture considered an act of barbarism, another might view as a legitimate and even necessary component of total war, especially when confronting an existential threat to their lands, livelihoods, and way of life. The colonists, in their own campaigns, were often equally, if not more, brutal in their treatment of indigenous captives, engaging in massacres, scalp bounties, and forced enslavement. Yet they selectively highlighted Native American cruelty to justify their own expansion and dehumanize their adversaries. Therefore, while acknowledging the harsh realities of torture and execution is essential for historical accuracy, it is equally important to contextualize these acts within the broader framework of indigenous warfare, cultural beliefs, and the escalating violence of the colonial encounter. These were not simply acts of savagery, as portrayed by conquerors, but often deeply symbolic, ritually significant, and strategically calculated responses within a desperate struggle for survival and sovereignty against overwhelming odds. This complex and often brutal aspect of captive treatment underscores the profound differences in cultural values and the dire stakes of the conflicts that shaped the destiny of the continent. In contrast to the grim realities of ritual retribution, yet another pragmatic and often strategic aspect of Native American interactions with foreign captives involved the sophisticated practices of ransom and exchange, highlighting a nuanced approach to human assets during times of conflict. Indigenous nations frequently recognize the inherent value of captives beyond their potential for integration or punishment. They were understood as valuable bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations with colonial powers. This was not a universal practice for every captive or every tribe, but it became a significant feature, particularly as interactions with Europeans intensified, and the nature of warfare evolved from purely intertribal conflicts to clashes involving disparate cultural and economic systems. Captives, whether European settlers, soldiers, or even enslaved Africans who had escaped to indigenous territories, could be held as collateral to secure demands, which might include the return of captured indigenous people, the cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal from disputed lands, or the provision of vital goods such as blankets, tools, firearms, or ammunition. The act of holding a captive for ransom was a clear demonstration of power and leverage, signaling to the colonial authorities that the Native American nation was a force to be reckoned with, capable of inflicting costs and demanding concessions. Negotiations surrounding such exchanges could be protracted and complex, involving intermediaries, intricate protocols, and a deep understanding of the opposing side's vulnerabilities and priorities. Moreover, the exchange of captives sometimes served to de-escalate tensions, offering a pathway to peace, or at least a temporary truce, thereby preventing further bloodshed. This transactional approach reveals a highly strategic mindset, demonstrating that Native American leaders were astute political actors who understood how to exploit their advantages in the ongoing struggle for sovereignty and survival. It also subtly reinforces the idea that even in times of war, human life, particularly that of a potential bargaining chip, could hold significant strategic value, allowing for outcomes that benefited the indigenous community. Unlike the European perspective, which often sought to completely subjugate or eliminate adversaries, the concept of exchange offered a more flexible and often mutually beneficial alternative, highlighting a different kind of pragmatism rooted in resource management and diplomatic leverage rather than pure conquest. This dimension of captive treatment underscores the diverse motivations driving Indigenous actions, moving beyond simplistic narratives of mere aggression or victimhood to reveal complex calculations and adaptive strategies in the face of immense pressure. The ability to use captives as a form of currency in the broader geopolitical landscape of colonial North America speaks volumes about the diplomatic acumen and resilience of Native American nations. The very fabric of Native American societies, their methods of warfare, and their intricate systems for dealing with captives underwent a profound and often devastating transformation with the onset of European colonization. This encounter was not merely a clash of arms, but a collision of fundamentally different worldviews, economic systems, and definitions of humanity and ownership. Prior to European arrival, Indigenous conflicts, while sometimes brutal, often adhered to specific cultural protocols, with captive-taking serving purposes like population replenishment through adoption or ritualistic expressions of mourning and vengeance. However, the relentless push of colonial expansion, driven by insatiable desires for land, resources, and wealth, dramatically intensified the scale and nature of warfare. European powers, locked in their own imperial rivalries, frequently exploited existing intertribal tensions, arming certain Native American nations against others, thereby escalating the frequency and lethality of conflicts. The introduction of firearms in particular revolutionized Indigenous warfare, making traditional combat tactics less effective and incentivizing raids for the acquisition of these new powerful weapons. This, in turn, could lead to a vicious cycle of warfare as tribes fought for control over trade routes and access to European goods, sometimes resulting in unprecedented levels of violence and depopulation, exacerbated by devastating European diseases for which Native Americans had no immunity. Crucially, the European concept of warfare often aimed at total conquest, territorial acquisition, and the subjugation or even extermination of enemy populations, a stark contrast to many Indigenous conflict traditions that focused more on securing captives, demonstrating bravery, or restoring balance rather than outright annihilation or permanent occupation. When Native Americans took European captives, they often applied their existing customs, attempting adoption or seeking ransom, but the colonizers rarely reciprocated with similar practices. Instead, Europeans frequently engaged in massacres, retaliatory violence against entire villages, the systematic enslavement of indigenous peoples, often selling them into the brutal plantation systems of the Caribbean, and the imposition of forced removals and assimilation policies. The colonial narratives themselves, often penned by the captors or their allies, frequently sensationalized the savagery of Native American practices while downplaying or outright omitting their own brutal actions, thereby creating a distorted historical record that served to justify their expansion and dehumanize Indigenous resistance. This asymmetrical power dynamic and the sheer scale of the colonial ambition fundamentally altered the landscape of captive treatment, pushing some Native American nations to adopt harsher measures as a desperate response to existential threats, mirroring, in some instances, the very ruthlessness they faced from their invaders. The period marked a tragic escalation where traditional ways of managing conflict and integrating outsiders were strained to breaking point under the relentless pressure of a foreign ideology predicated on domination. Ultimately, to truly grasp the profound complexities of how Native American nations navigated the volatile landscape of foreign captivity during their valiant struggle against colonization, we must dismantle the ingrained, simplistic narratives that have long dominated historical discourse. There was no monolithic Native American way of treating captives. Instead, a dynamic spectrum of practices emerged, each deeply rooted in the specific cultural norms, spiritual beliefs, and socio-economic realities of individual tribes, and constantly adapting to the escalating pressures of an existential conflict. From the remarkable capacity for adoption and assimilation, where former adversaries could become integrated family members, to the more pragmatic and often temporary forms of servitude and labour, these approaches showcased a nuanced understanding of human resources and community resilience that often diverged sharply from European colonial mindsets. Yet, we cannot overlook the harsh realities of retribution and ritual, where torture and execution, while horrifying, were frequently embedded within specific cultural or retaliatory frameworks, distinct from mere savagery, and often a desperate response to the extreme violence inflicted upon them. Furthermore, the strategic deployment of captives for ransom and exchange revealed sophisticated diplomatic acumen, transforming individuals into valuable bargaining chips in a high-stakes geopolitical game. All of these practices, however, were irrevocably altered and intensified by the overwhelming and often brutal impact of European colonization, which introduced unprecedented levels of warfare, disease, and an alien concept of total conquest and dehumanizing chattel slavery. The clash of these vastly different worldviews created a tragic legacy, where indigenous peoples fought not just for land, but for their very right to exist and define their own societies, including their own ethical and practical responses to warfare. Understanding this multi-layered history compels us to move beyond convenient stereotypes and embrace a more comprehensive, empathetic, and ultimately truthful account of Native American agency, resilience, and their often misunderstood responses to an unprecedented period of invasion. It's a history that reminds us that humanity, in all its complexity, exists on all sides of a conflict, and that the narratives of the past are rarely as straightforward as they first appear.